stress again that I was never High Commissioner to Maldives. That honor goes to Arun Banerjee, who's sitting there in the audience, and maybe he should have been here instead of me. But I did involved with Maldives for a long time. My first visit to Maldives was in 1987, I think, with then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. And then after the coup attempt, the then President Gayoom requested Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi to send me to Maldives because they had a lot of things, a lot of requests to convey to us. And I flew there in that situation. I was also, funnily, it was almost a family involvement in the Indian action to prevent the coup. I was the one who received the first call from our acting High Commissioner. And from then on, for the next 24 hours, Ronan Sen, Joint Secretary to the Prime Minister, and myself, we were the point persons directing our operations. And once we established contact with Zaki, who was a senior minister in the government, we did not close the line, and that call lasted about 21 hours because we were afraid that if we close the line, we won't be able to establish contact. And Zaki was feeding us live information on what's happening in Maldives. So this was a great help. And to deepen my involvement further, the first aircraft, Indian Air Force aircraft, to land in Maldives was piloted by my brother-in-law. And among the fighter escort, my other brother-in-law was flying the fighter aircraft. So it was a very personal involvement. But to move on to maybe a little background on the start of the democracy movement. Gayoom had been in power for years, but he inadvertently sparked off the democracy movement by his own policies. Since there were no facilities for higher education in Maldives, the government would liberally give scholarships to their promising students to go abroad, including to India, to study and come back. Some didn't come back, but many did. And they didn't go back just with degrees. They went back with ideas about democracy, about freedom of speech, about freedom of assembly, and they were full of these ideas and hoping to implement them in Maldives. And I remember talking to my friends from Maldives on several occasions that, your people coming back from abroad are slowly reaching a critical mass, and that there is bound to be a movement for democracy and freedom. And the present government has a choice. They can either lead the movement or they'll be swept aside by it. And some of the ministers who were my friends did take this to heart, and some of them even resigned and joined the democracy movement. So this is the background to the start of the movement. But as always with a compromised constitution, there are problems. In fact, majority voting system has a problem always, as we have seen sometimes in India also. I mean, there has to be something seriously wrong with a system where the candidate who got 48% or more of the votes in the first round was ousted by a candidate who got about 23% of the vote in the second round. That was one start of the problem there itself. Then I think President Nasheed was too much of a Democrat. in some ways. One of the kernels of the problem which surfaced now was the judiciary. The Constitution laid down the method by which the judges will be appointed, but the judges appointed by Gayoom declared that they had been appointed for life and they cannot be removed regardless of the Constitution. I think President Nasheed should have taken stronger action to enforce the Constitution, which he didn't. And he also refused to take action against those corrupt politicians who had facilitated the dictatorship for years and years. He felt that by being a Democrat himself, others will follow and become Democrats themselves. And this is akin to my friend Kuldeep Nair standing with a candle on the border at Wagah, hoping to shame the Pakistanis into behaving very well. It doesn't work. The democracy movement in Maldives is in deep trouble. I think the international community has a role to play. India has a big role to play because many Maldivians look up to India, and the group that is currently in power is deeply anti-Indian. In fact, that was one of the reasons. And the other tragedy in the current situation is that the uniforms, that is the armed forces, have tasted power. And as the history of our region shows, that once the uniforms taste power, it's very difficult to get them to go back to their barracks. So this is going to be another long problem that Maldives will face. As I said, India has a role to play. I don't want to speculate what that might be. I think we missed a chance when the coup was playing out live on TV, that we did not take strong action. Now we find ourselves, as always, constrained by the fear of being dubbed as Big Brother interfering. We always have this problem. But even before the current situation, when the democracy movement was going on, I found that our government was scared of talking with pro-democracy activists. We had no problem talking with the opposition members coming from Pakistan. Benazir Bhutto came and she got all the treatment. Opposition members from Sri Lanka, from Bangladesh, they were all met by high-level dignitaries. But if anybody came from Maldives, we were scared of upsetting Gayoom. And there were just a few of us who kept on entertaining them and getting them to beat people, and that kept their hopes alive. So now India has to carve out a role for itself. I think we have an important role to play. I think maybe this meeting will throw up some ideas.
My name is Raghu Menon, and as Raki said, I work for the India office of Amnesty International. I was also part of a small delegation, Amnesty International delegation, that went to Maldives recently on a fact-finding mission, especially in light of what the ambassador and Ibra have been talking about, what has been happening in the last 2 years especially. I would like to concentrate my few words on my observations, of the human rights situation in Maldives, and human rights, as we've known from our own experience in our own democracy in the region, around the world, are quite the mirror to see the state of democracy in any country. And unfortunately, in Maldives, the situation is quite grim. Human rights is in a state of free fall, if I may. There is, as you know, by all accounts that we've received, that we have seen, that we've heard from various sources, in Maldives and people associated with Maldivian affairs. The government and its agencies are maintaining a sustained, are on a path of sustained crackdown on basic civil liberties, such as freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, the basic tenets of judicial independence and impartiality have deeply eroded, as we've heard from Ibra and the others. So in that situation, I think we can see how the state of democracy and the human rights situation are so deeply intermixed, and how they are connected, and how a situation, an improvement in human rights could also hopefully mean an improvement in the democratic environment in the Maldives. In our fact-finding mission, we concentrated on a few key elements. One was the politically provoked, or the political charges that have been laid on doors of some key members of the opposition. But it would be unfair to say that it's just the members of the opposition who have been attacked. I mean, they have been the ones who have been bearing the brunt of the attack in these terms, but also the three prominent cases that we looked at, of which two were people actually, one was the sitting defense minister, and the third person was a former MP and the deputy speaker of the Maldivian Majlis, the parliament. So there is not just, so anyone seemingly in opposition of the current dispensation seems to be acted upon, and the lack of free trial is so blatant that anyone can just by just reading reports tell how there is a sustained effort to find someone guilty even before the process starts. I mean, the three cases that I was mentioning was, one, of course, is former President Mohammad Nasheed. The other is the imprisonment of former Defense Minister Mohammad Nazim. And the third one is the Deputy Speaker I mentioned, Ahmed Nazim. I'd just like to quickly tell you about some of the key concerns that we saw in the trial of Mohammad Nasheed to start with. Here is a president of a country who has been a former president by then. He's been, as Ibra said, he's already mentioned about how the two judges on his trial, two of the judges on the trial, were acted as witnesses. So from the beginning, there was absolutely no facade of impartiality in this process. How can and somehow it's almost akin to dark humor, really, where the defense keeps telling the court that this is what is happening. How can you have two witnesses, also the judges, ruling on this case? And they go to the high court, because this case is in the trial court, the criminal court. They go to the appellate court, and the high court tells them that because the trial is already being heard, we cannot pronounce a judgment on this. We will pronounce a judgment on whether the judges should be recused after the trial is done. Then what's the point of having a trial? Former President Nasheed is arrested on 22nd February, and his first trial, the date of trial, is the very next day. This is a president who has been arrested under some serious charges, and he and his team is not given any time for preparing for the defense. In fact, it's so comical that when the defense team learns of the first trial date, they try and go to the court and try to present their credentials, because you have to, under Maldivian law, I think you have to sign up to defend someone at least 2 or 3 days before the trial. So because the trial is the very next day, his defense team cannot legally or administratively even defend him. The first trial goes on without actually President Nasheed even having basic counsel, because the court itself refused to give him any legal counsel. This is followed by what can only be described as the fastest case ever. 13 trials in 19 days a trial like this in any country around the world, the semblance of judicial impartiality would take much, much longer, because serious charges means that the defense should have the right under international human rights law and Maldivian law to prepare properly, to have the papers, to prepare their witnesses, to know what the prosecution is going to say. But 13 trials in 19 days tells you that no one was prepared for this, and it was quite from the outset going to be a sham of a trial, and that's exactly what happened. At one point, in fact, actually, towards the end, the defense team resigned and said that we cannot continue with the sham, and we will not defend Nasheed. And then again, the last 2 or 3 trials, the court continues this prosecution without giving him legal representation. At one point, towards the end of the trial, the court says that the defense actually does not even need to present its witnesses, because there is no way they can refute the evidence already provided by the prosecution. This is an impartial trial, supposed to be an impartial trial, and so it was quite clear what was going on here. In the defense minister's case, he is close to the establishment. He is picked up randomly in a raid to his place, and also we see similar problems where from the outset it's quite clear that this person has to be found guilty, and he will be found guilty. And many tenets of fair trial were overlooked. His defense team again was not given enough time to prepare. His defense team was not even given all the documents that the prosecution had submitted in the trial. And so how do you expect someone to defend themselves when you don't even tell them what charges they are being prosecuted under? The case of the former deputy speaker is also quite problematic, because here is a person who has been acquitted by 2 courts, the trial court and the appellate court, in 4 cases, and then when it's appealed by the prosecution in the Supreme Court, instead of actually asking for a retrial, because no Supreme Court conducts a trial itself, it starts a trial of its own, saying that we shall try this person, and he's found guilty. So what these 3 cases actually, and the reason why we try to highlight these 3 cases was, if this is the situation of important people with supporters on the street, people with access to power, access to the international media, if this is the state of these prominent leaders, you can quite imagine what the situation is for other people, for people that Ibra talks about, people who are on the streets protesting, young boys and girls who are actually out on the streets. And it's quite brave of them, because that is another problem, that there is the crackdown on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly tells you how what almost an authoritarian regime situation is being run in the Maldives. You have protesters who are picked up and illegally detained, and they are told, out of any provision in the court or in the constitution, that they cannot further participate in any other protests. It's called conditioning. They're conditioned, and so they're not supposed to be outside between 4 to 7. Some are told that you cannot participate in protests for 60 days, the next 15 days. There are criminal gangs that Ibra was talking about, who have been attacking the protesters, who have been throwing petrol and crude oil on the protesters, threatening to set them alight. They have not been prosecuted. They have not been arrested. The freedom of expression is also under deep threat. You have had situations where the media has been under attack. There have been threats issued, again, death threats and other threats, physical harm issued to the media on Twitter. There is a case of Ahmad Rilwan that Ibra spoke about, which there hasn't been any proper investigation. So I think in light of this, we're a little rushed for time here. The situation looks quite grim, the human rights situation, and might I say that tells you the state of democracy. I think, as Ibra said, and as Ambassador himself said, that we should hope that the international community, especially India, being an influential neighbor, should sustain its efforts to help the civil society and create an environment for a healthy democracy in Maldives. Yesterday was a bit of a start. India made quite a strong statement at the UPR. It's not the strongest of the forums, but it was good to see that India raised these issues about the politicization of the judiciary, about attack on the freedom of press, and very interestingly, India reminded Maldives, and I'd just like to quote, that maintaining public trust requires adherence to due process. And I think this is something that needs to be kept in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I go on to my presentation, just a couple of words on the work that my organization has done in the Maldives. We basically work on two main issues. One is right to information law. So we were closely involved in the drafting of the drafting and then the consultations that followed the Right to Information Act that was passed last year in Maldives. And on policing, we've done a lot of research on policing standards, as well as some of the new mechanisms that the 2008 Constitution put down. So we've been doing mainly research and a little bit of capacity building. So most of our reports and writings are of course available on our website if anybody is interested. And I'm happy to share more details. Now, the previous speakers have really elaborated a lot on the current situation and the main problems that are there, so I don't want to repeat any of that. But what I want to do is just spell out a couple of problems with the reform process actually, that now with the advantage of hindsight one can lay down a bit more clearly. Because the 2008 Constitution, as was pointed out, was fairly robust, was at par with the international standards, and yet you see a gap, you see a huge democracy deficit on the ground today. So why is that happening? What were the issues with the reforms, particularly in the judiciary and in law enforcement, that we are seeing the kind of problems today, that we're seeing the kind of behaviors today? Three things that I'll highlight today. One is the appointment system that was laid down for both the judiciary and law enforcement itself was actually had issues. Coming from years of autocratic rule, the emphasis I think of the reform process was very much on making it as independent as possible, which basically means reducing the role of the government on processes and making it, bringing in independent voices. That was the focus, which was good, but I think there was selective application of certain principles and standards, not a complete package. For instance, in the judicial appointments, there was a 2-year period that the Constitution laid down for the Judicial Service Commission, which was an independent body created for the first time, in Maldives for appointments of judges. But the rules, so the Constitution really laid down the principle and the broad contours of what the JSC is supposed to do. Now thereafter, the rules that the JSC would follow, how open the process would be, what would be the criteria against which judges should be evaluated. None of that was debated as rigorously as it needs to be in any transitional democracy. And similarly, you see in law enforcement also on policing. Now, policing itself, is fairly new. A civilian police institution is fairly new in Maldives because till 2004 it was part of the defense forces. So it's only in 2004 that you see, it being separated as well as an effort being made to expand policing in the country. Now, the 2008 Constitution, the process that it laid down for appointment of the police commissioner, which is a very crucial aspect of democratic reforms, was very, very basic, which is it left the power basically with the president to appoint and dismiss the commissioner. Again, the Police Act, which is supposed to flesh out some of these principles, has not focused on that and has left it at that. So I think that was one area which should have got more attention at that point of time, to make it more robust, to make it more transparent, so that public can also see and understand the nature of reforms that is happening, because all of this is very new for a large section of the population. As Mr. Ibrahim was mentioning, there were people who were coming back with these ideas, but then there are a large section of people for whom these ideas were very new. So one had to take them on board to build sort of a national consensus on it, which was missing essentially. So that's one, sort of main issue with the appointment system, I think, that one can highlight now. The other is again the idea of external oversight, independent oversight. The Constitution lays down a number of independent commissions to oversee the functions of the government. The Parliament itself, was mandated to set up a parliamentary committee to oversee the security forces. In principle, very good, very important. But again, fleshing out some of these principles has not happened, and that's been an issue. You have a parliamentary committee that is overseeing security forces. You also have a police integrity commission that was set up to oversee the police, behavior and police action. Then you have the Human Rights Commission of Maldives. So and then you have the Anti-Corruption Commission. So various commissions were set up. Not enough attention on building a collaborative framework between these institutions. And fleshing out what their specific mandates. Complaints are coming against the police; they're going to various institutions, and then there is not always a coordinated effort between the two. So that has been an issue, and that needs to, moving forward, I think that will be an area to focus on. And also to remember that, this is an idea of oversight bodies is something that even developed or established democracies struggle with. In terms of, there's tremendous resistance within the government, within bureaucracy to accept, involvement of independent and, external people. So one has to take that on board when we evaluate even the performance of these institutions. So that has to be, again, consensus. I'll come back to consensus building. There's a lot of space for national level dialogue. Not so much, a lot of problem with transition democracy is the role that international actors start playing. And again, that has its limitations. It has to be a national process. You have to go into the islands and build consensus. I mean, you've set up a local government system, but I don't know how functional the local councils really are or what the people's perception are. They might even miss the older system. So I mean, these are some of the things that could be focused, now with the current crisis in Mali. And finally, the third thing that I want to highlight is you set up an independent judiciary, but your criminal law reform process has yet not happened. It's been tremendously slow. We hear that the penal code is finally ready. It was accepted by the Parliament and will be implemented now in July or in the next few months. But the other substantive laws, the Criminal Procedure, the Evidence Act, none of these major criminal laws have yet been brought in tune with the new constitution. So and it's been about 7-8 years now since the constitution. So one has to, when we're evaluating the performance of judiciary, this is huge area of weakness or a failure in a sense of the reform process, because you cannot expect either the police or the prosecution or the judiciary to really improve its methods without having basic criminal laws. So they end up relying obviously on the older laws, so which allow a lot of power and allow a lot of discretion. So there's that inconsistency which has to be addressed immediately. And there is emphasis on this within Maldives. There are actors and actors both within the state as well as international community that is looking at it. But the pace has been a problem, and that needs to be looked at. And finally, just an emphasis on sir, you mentioned in promoting more people-to-people contact in the region. I think before that, I don't know enough about this, but as much as we've traveled, we do get a sense that there's a huge disconnect between Mali and the islands. So I think that has to be somewhere in the focus area, because and I think it's also reflected in the voting patterns, because Mali is more pro-MDP and the other islands are generally more pro-Gayoom. So I mean that has to be the focus when we're moving forward before we bring in people from the region. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
I will speak more of as a sort of someone who is tracking South Asia democratization process. And what are the trends, what are the patterns that's actually emerging? And I do it quite often for the Carnegie Endowment. They have a program called Rising Democracy Network. So I'll be looking largely from a very holistic, from a very broad perspective, and in which I'll of course cite some of the tensions and some of the patterns emerging in Maldives' experience. What we can call as democratic transition, and then see how it actually fits with the democratization theory, and how democratization been happening all around the world, and where does Maldives fit? A year back, in fact, Economist, this influential news magazine, made a focus about in its special issue on democracy. It's a very extensive survey. In fact, one should see it actually. Those of you would have not found time. One of the chapters that devoted was about South Asia, and which claimed that it is probably most happening place in terms of democracy, and it made a kind of very poignant kind of focus that at last entire South Asia is actually now a democracy, and probably in 2015 the odd man out in South Asia will be probably Sri Lanka, because it has in mind with Rajapaksa, the way he was consolidating and driving Sri Lanka to authoritarianism and sort of thing. So it said, but if today you look at actually it's not Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has actually gone back, and it's now really probably consolidating its democratic way. It's Maldives. The odd man out is Maldives today. With a lot of concern, my friends have been saying this. So where do we actually fit Maldives in terms of democratization? And democratization, as one knows, it's not a sort of linear theory. That once you have election and democracy strengthens and it evolves in a sort of linear direction. It doesn't. It's a non-linear kind of. It can it takes shape, it collapses, and it again takes shape. It happens in a very very sort of back and forth and in very diverse way. So Maldives case is really, as a democracy student, it doesn't really surprises me. It's if you look at the South Asia kind of experience in democratization, it's pretty normal. To say very in a sort of there are concerns, there are issues, but it's pretty normal. Most of the countries, except for probably India, have gone through this sort of times. And today, what's happening in Maldives, I would say, is to extend what Huntington wrote actually in his third wave. It's the democracy wherever it happens, mostly through top-down approach, stays endures and strengthens its roots, and probably lasts long. Then democracy that happens through bottom-up approach. And Maldives actually, I know that what Ambassador Sadhu said that inadvertently Gayam sort of sow the seeds of democracy by sending thousands of students to read outside and come back. But he never imagined that this would actually lead to democracy movement. But democracy happened in Maldives largely through bottom of it, through social movements with lot of mobilization, mass sort of consolidation of civil society and the demand, and Nasheed and some of those people played a very stellar role. They were imprisoned and they made a sort of lasting contribution. So, but problem is that wherever in most of the cases, with some probably exceptions, wherever the democracy happens through a sort of bottom-up approach, the likelihood of its collapse is very much. And there is always there is something called the remnant of dictatorship or authoritarianism always remains with the system. And in Maldives, exactly it has happened. The guy grudgingly allowed, and he lost the election and he allowed, but then he retained the control by other means. Most of the institutions were his own, and he had some connection or other. So in a sense, actually, this remnants of this dictatorship or authoritarianism will keep bothering this country for a long time, I think. And because institutions are very fragile, as Devani said. They are actually just baby democracy. Things are just picking up. 3 years odd time in which Nasheed cannot really actually strengthen those institutions and take deeper. So in a sense, Maldives is unfortunate that the country never got an opportunity to at least 5 or 10 years in which democratic institutions and many of these things could have been taken deeper sort of roots. That didn't happen. So unfortunately, you have a situation in which some of those institutions, which in some way are linked with the earlier dictator, have actually created a situation in which you have a situation in which democracy is most likely to collapse. And the major problem is, it's I think still if you look at many of those with such a gloomy scenario of democracy, there are, I think, I see as a democracy student a lot of actually positive things in Maldives. The first, the chances in even wherever democracy happens through grassroots movements, other things, is that it can quickly come back. If there are even collapse, it can quickly regain because the civil society is stronger and people are aware of their rights. And today, a lot of information are flowing, and this is the classic case that we can still have a Skype with someone. So the regime's ability to control information and sabotage any sort of way is actually limited today. So that actually is a positive thing. And then second is, if you look at also within this sort of institutional exchanges that happen between election commission and judiciary. Okay, we can say that judiciary is actually probably politicized, and there's very little hope that the justice will prevail from the institution. But if you look at election commission, see, the problem with the Maldives is the electoral system. The manner in which Ambassador also raised this. That you have to have repeat election. Someone has to really win 50% plus. So that actually created a repeat kind of election. But election commission, if you see, even Nasid has also accepted that election commission did to the extent possible that a free and fair kind of elections. So there is no dispute, and that's the reason why he even accepted the election outcome. So in a sense, election commission is one institution which has stood and probably shows some sort of grit and determination that the independent institutions which are very critical for democracy, democratic growth, at least you can see some bright spot here. And then the second thing is, if you look at the press is also doing a very stellar job with all sort of problems and restrictions, also mass kind of arrest, and the press is also doing a good job. So this is also positive things. But if you look at overall, just last part on overall scenario, what are the prospects in terms of democracy remaining this thing? I think this is where it's a small country, very tiny country with 350,000 odd population, sort of a international community and including India, have a very sort of their tasks are very clearly defined, very limited also. You can actually use all sort of influence, even think of sanctions or even Commonwealth membership. Many things can be actually used, but I say with a caution that it has to be with very cautiously how to move, because it's a tiny country. If you just put the pressure a little, it can easily descend into chaos and repressed. The regime can be more repressive. And unfortunately today you have a geopolitics in which China is openly sort of weighing that tiny country for its geopolitical needs. So situation might actually take a very nasty turn, and you have seen what happened in Ukraine. Thank you.
I'll be talking about two things. One regarding how constitution and democracy has operated in practice in the last couple of years, and second, what it implies for foreign policy of Maldives and how it has impacted India. As we all know that multi-party democracy was introduced with promulgation of new constitution in 2008 and subsequent election that took place, which brought Nasid to power. However, there was a setback to this multi-party democracy when Nasid resigned in tumultuous circumstances on February 7, 2012, and Wahid Hassan Manik assumed power without violence, as Maldivian constitution says that in this kind of eventuality, vice president is supposed to take over. However, there was allegation by MDP that it was nothing but a coup d'etat, and MDP said that president was actually forced to resign by rogue elements of police and military and supporters of former president Gayoom. He said that law enforcement agencies say that if president does not resign, then there will be a bloodbath, so political unrest. And two important reasons for this political unrest are economic crisis and Islamic radicals who are present in Maldives, a section. Now, talking of economic crisis, Maldives has witnessed the worst crisis of any country going through democratic transition. This has been said by IMF and World Bank. Nasheed had inherited this crisis from former President Gayoom. Actually, I don't have time to go into detail like how Gayoom had created this crisis, because he had recruited large number of people before he demitted office, and he had started a lot of construction work for which he had not provided in budget, etc. So, country was almost on the verge of bankruptcy. There was rising prices of various commodity. Actually, when Nasheed was in power, I had the opportunity to visit Maldives. Then I could see firsthand that there was severe dollar crunch, and the exchange rate was going up. Like people were getting less rupiah for actually they had to pay more rupiah for getting $1. Dollar becomes very important in Maldives because it's an import dependent nation, and people also go out to avail health services. However, in this situation, India was trying to help out Nasheed, and but problem became bigger with time. Now, second, the role played by Islamic radicals in country and its politics. In 1970, two different set of ideas took root in Maldives. One, progressive. This was the time when Gayoom started tourism, and it was expanded as an industry. Then Maldivians also, some of the Maldivians also went to Western University, including President Nasheed. Then these people came back to the country and brought with them progressive ideas. But the other ideologies also arrived in the island at the same time. Saudi Wahhabism and South Asian Deobandism took root in the country. Interestingly, this also came to the country through the same route of education and travel. Saudi Arabia financially supported the development of Wahhabi religious study. People started traveling to Pakistan for jihadist training. However, this is very interesting that Islamic extremism was under control when Gayoom was president, and but same forces asserted under a democratic dispensation. I had the opportunity to talk to some of the ministers in MDP government at that time. They said that actually democracy has provided them a lot of freedom, so these people are coming out in open, and actually this will help us to deal with them better, because we will be able to identify who are these people, and then we can take a step. Nasheed wanted to relax strict Islamic laws to promote tourism. However, this was thwarted by assertion of religious right and judiciary. Nasheed also he was forced to roll back a plan of allowing more multinational companies from setting up resorts on unutilized islands. He was forced to briefly close all hotel, spas and health centers as fundamentalists were against it. Then radicals also demolished monuments constructed by Pakistan at atrocity during the SAARC summit. Then they were also opposed to Nasheed's restoration of diplomatic relations with Israel, and there was also attempt to transform the school curriculum. One very interesting thing about this present of this politics of Islamic radicalism in Maldives is that they have been changing side very frequently. When Nasheed was in power, Adalat was part of the government. When Yamin was in power, Adalat was part of the government. Only today his religious minister has resigned. Day before, yeah. So this is very interesting, dynamics of the Maldivian politics, that whosoever is in power, religious groups are with them. As we know that the crisis in Maldives was triggered by the arrest of Chief Criminal Judge Abdullah Muhammad. Judge had ordered the release of government critic and opposition leader Muhammad Jamil Ahmad. He accused Nasheed's government of working against state religion Islam with the support of Christians and Jews. No doubt, judiciary in Maldives is in mess, and but the action taken by Nasheed was not appreciated. Actually, the way he acted against the judge, it created suspicion in the minds of especially among the elite, that it was a drive against judiciary and was politically motivated. So, because of this unwise step, Nasheed converted a political standoff with religious overtones into an impasse between his government and judiciary. This precipitated the crisis and ultimately led to his ouster. As I discussed, Wahid came to power, and once again presidential elections were held under pressure because there was continuous political turmoil in the country. And however, what we saw that government tried to prevent Nasib by implicating him in court case, but there was pressure from India and international community. Nasib famously took shelter in Indian embassy, and some kind of deal was agreed upon, and Nasib was allowed to take part into the elections. There are four main contenders in presidential polls: Nasheed, Wahid, and Qasim Ibrahim, and Yamin. Subsequent developments, however, indicated the weakness of democratic institutions in Maldives and their misuse for electoral benefits by influential candidates. Then what we see that these democratic institutions are not only weak, but there is also a clash taking place between these institutions. When actually multi-party democracy was installed in Maldives, it was realized that there is a need to build working institutions, modernize the political system, strengthen oversight mechanism, and overhaul the criminal justice system, including the writing of a new penal law. This could not happen, and instead what we saw was a disruptive partisan politics from May 2009. MDP lost control of parliament because Nasib, as it was pointed out, that he was too much of a democrat, and after becoming president, he broke alliance and went alone for the election, and as a result, he could not get enough numbers in parliament. And since the constitution of Maldives work in a very clear fashion that the power is divided between president and parliament, so for the smooth running of the government, you require control in both the places. Opposition sensed weakness, and they started street protests, etc., and that created unrest in the country. And things actually did not improve even under Wahid. A survey of Transparency International, it said that parliament, parties, and judiciary, the pillars of democracy, are the most corrupt institutions of Maldives. It poses a strong challenge before the democratic institutions in Maldives to establish their credibility. There has been international effort to strengthen election machinery. International community is aware of the weakness of Maldivian democratic institution. India has invested a great deal of political and economic capital in Maldives. It wants multi-party democracy to survive in the country. In 2008, India has donated electronic voting machine worth 15 million rupees. Maldivian election chief visited India for training. He saw election being conducted into the country, and United States, etc. They have all placed money to the system. However, during the elections which were conducted, what we saw that these institutions were used to further political and electoral interests, like judiciary, of which Judicial Commission, Qasim Ibrahim was part. So he manipulated judiciary at that time in his favor. Yeah, and so institutions worked at cross purposes, and because of that, the cause of democracy is suffered in the country. This attempt to manipulate institutions was once again seen during parliamentary elections. Judiciary once again played a hyperactive role. It sacked election commissioner for topic, and he was actually sentenced. It was criticized by international community. Maldivian government asked the international partners to respect Maldivian constitution. In the parliamentary poll, Progressive Coalition of Yamin, Qasim Ibrahim, and MDA, they secured 53 out of 85 seats. This manipulation of institution continues in present times. This is seen in charging of Nasib with terrorism, and in Rust trials, which has been discussed in great detail, and also in conviction of Nasheed and other leaders, including Defense Minister. What is the future of, quickly in half a minute, what is the future of multi-party democracy in the Maldives? Pressure on multi-party democracy is from three quarters, the remnant of Gayu Mera, those international players that want to enhance their presence in Indian Ocean, and Islamic extremists. However, a political scenario in Maldives has changed sooner than expected, and as we know that Qasim Ibrahim has left the coalition. So, but this has also, the way I see it, it appears that this change in equation has also, precipitated the present crisis. Because after the election, basically Nasheed was reconciled to the fact that he's lost the election for whatever reason, and despite it being controversial, but he was reconciled to the fact that he's going to sit in the opposition, he's going to restructure MDP, etc., etc. But the moment Qasim Ibrahim left a coalition, it reignited desire for power or to go for protest, etc. Foreign policy in the sense, Nasheed, when Nasheed was in power, he used to say that he is following India First policy. However, there were some doubts that he was also very close to West as well as China. But under subsequent regime, what we saw that Wahid was very close to China, and Abdullah Yamin once again is very close to China, and the most important thing is that for the first time, Chinese President Xi Jinping visited Maldives when Abdullah Yamin came to power, and there is a clear-cut, tilt in Maldivian politics towards China, and Maldives has decided to be one of the founder members of AIIB, and it has also decided to sign a free trade agreement. So to conclude, the present government may not be reflecting the true will of Maldivian people. Second, multi-party elections may not have been completely free and fair, but it's an important step in the strengthening of democracy. Yamin controls the parliament, but his majority has got significantly reduced. Dictatorship may not have re-emerged in the Maldives, but definitely forces loyal to Gaim have reasserted themselves. And impact of change of regime in Maldives is already seen in its foreign policy, greater space for China, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. No doubt India has fallen on the priority list of present Maldivian rulers, and India does not enjoy the same advantages. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Now I invite Shumon Chakravarti for as the last speaker, and then thank you all for waiting, and please continue to wait so we can take a few questions from you.
Well, now that we have established that Maldives is a country, believe you me, it's a very difficult task. And it was a very difficult task when I first visited the country as a journalist in 2006. It was very easy here because all of us seem to know about Maldives. So it took me about 5 months to sell the story. It took me a lot of baggage to cover the nascent, democracy movement. Nasheed's ambassador Sadev is here, and he would bear me out because his dear friend, the man with whom he had that 21-hour call, because he insists that it's 30-hour call always. So that call, that man called Zaki, he enabled me to, it's usually very humid, and enabled me to buy a shirt because I had nothing absolutely since I went there. I was just carrying my laptop and my bag. So Maldives is a difficult story to sell. And why I tell you this, I'll give you another small anecdote. When I was dragged into doing this whole thing, a digital platform, so I said, let's have footprints, in our neighborhood, and let's do microsites on them. So I asked my team can we do something called Focus Maldives, because Nasheed's thing was happening and all of that, and it all happened in the last 1 month. So my product manager, who came and joined us from Tehilka, he told me, where should I look? I said, Indian Ocean. He said, left or right? So that's where we start with Maldives usually. So that's why I say that it's pretty easy here. Himal, there's a magazine quite respected called Himal. It was actually relaunched in IIC about 2 or 3 years back in a different format. And Himal, their tagline is the South Asian magazine. They usually have given me, just before the coup, they had given me a name in Maldives, because I'm known as the $800 million man there, because I broke the $800 million oil scam. And so Himal, because I broke that story, Himal wanted me to write for them, and that's where we actually started. They did their first ever cover on Maldives, their first ever proper cover on Maldives. There was no cover on Maldives in Himal before. We usually sell Maldives as the 100% Sunni Muslim nation, the most secular. Those days are gone. And when people tell you that there are new religious political parties, and under Gayoom they were in control, please do not believe it, because under Gayoom it all started. What started under Gayoom is a very interesting thing. Nobody looks beyond the cultured image, the crafted image that Gayoom had for himself, a very suave man at that. He had this whole image going across the world, and not just in India, and he had this whole crafted image where he is known as the learned man. But where did he have his education? Nobody looks at that. Gayoom studied in Egypt. He was the harbinger of all these radical forces who today are so active in the Maldives. It all happened under him when the democracy movement started. When the democracy movement started, that was one of Gayoom's fallback option. All these kids that he used to send to the madrasas across the world with scholarships so liberally, as Ambassador Sahdev was mentioning, all these some of them were brought back, some were encouraged, to go and get more radical training. That's the time when he got the idea. He told people that there should be a religious party. That's the time Maldives started losing that secular tag. Now I'll tell you a fact which many people might not know about Maldives. I'm sure many of you might. But did you know when the first resorts were opened in 1977, 78? I think, the year I was born, I think. So those two resorts were owned by two of the most wealthiest families in the Maldives. And people used to travel there. The Westerners used to come there. They were beautiful, very eco-friendly, I want to tell you. And they were, all of them, both of them actually, were nude resorts. That is Maldives' beginning of the story of tourism. That is Maldives' beginning of, that's where the tag, got along. I've spoken to many of my friends whose parents own those resorts or they work there, and they have shared experiences with me, what life used to be. So what I'm trying to emphasize is the fact that today there is an Adalat party. There was no Adalat party. There was no religious party in the Maldives. And, as strange as it may seem, because strange usually are political bedfellows, Raghu spoke about the former defense minister, Nazim. Well, I remember in 2012, it was the same Nazim who was roaming around on the streets the day the coup happened, and I call it a coup. The day the coup happened, he was roaming around with a pistol in his hands. He was the one who were directing all the troops. He was the one who was captured on video, getting the police, getting the armed forces, driving them into the presidential palace. He was one of the prime movers. I don't have any sympathy for Nazim, but many people have. His differences with Yamin. The point I'm trying to make, the parliament today is a cabal. It's completely a cabal. A new oil scam is brewing. I'm telling you this. There is a new excess of evil which has happened in Maldives, and that excess is being given two main points. are being run by Yamin and his tourism minister Adil. That everybody knows. But what you don't know is what Gayoom is doing behind the picture. Do we talk about Gayoom anymore? Because we are concentrated on the regime. This regime, I completely agree, is more, it's worse than Gayoom can ever be. Yamin doesn't care for any crafted image, any culture, anything. He is in your face. He will not care for anything, and that is what Yamin has always been. Every Maldivian you speak to, anybody who loves their democracy, they will tell you that Yamin is 200% more dangerous than Gayoom ever was. Gayoom finally had to give in to the democracy movement. But Yamin is not going to do that. Which brings me back to Yamin again, because what surprised me in 2012 when the coup happened was our former Prime Minister and his government, the UPA government, Manmohan Singh's reaction. Because I think I had the privilege to do that story first. What exactly was Yamin doing when the coup was happening in the Indian High Commission? What exactly were some other members of their fraternity, that particular lobby doing in the Indian High Commission? What made Manmohan Singh declare the government of Wahid, give him legitimacy on, I think, day one? I have still not figured out, but what I have figured out possibly is the fact that there were some behind the counter dealings. There was something to do about not just resorts, but in this case about us, about who the airport duty-free contract should go to. Should it have been GMR, or was it another Indian company? That's where the conflict lies. That's what happened. But then I blame it all, as Ambassador Sadev said, Nasheed was too much of a democrat. I blame it all on Nasheed. I call him Anni. When he came to power, and Ambassador Sadev will bear me out, and he says it right when he says that it's so difficult for the Indian government never used to, they were so afraid of meeting the Maldivian opposition. Maldives was sold to me by Maria Didi, their first woman MP, as well as somebody who was the foreign minister later on, but better known as Ambassador Naseem in the Maldives. Usually they like coffee in Maldives. I don't know why, but coffee is quite an addiction there. But they sold me Maldives over a cup of tea at a press conference they came to do where only 3 journalists were present. So, and I had not gone even to do the story. I had gone to understand Maldives, what Maldives was all about. So I know exactly the pains, the struggles that we had to do to make this opposition meet Indian leaders. Ambassador Sadev always took the lead. He hosted them. But the fact always remained, even after Nasheed came to power, what happened was people didn't realize what's happening. What's happening in Maldives, what is going to happen in Maldives, that Gayoom actually never went out of power. And I think somebody pointed that out, that Gayoom never went out of power because the judiciary was in his hand. And what is the judiciary in Maldives? I mean, if somebody wants to talk about judiciary, let's do dialogue with them. Who do you do dialogue with? You do dialogue with the Chief Justice, who barely passed his class 5. You do dialogue with a judge who was caught on camera having, doing interesting things. Do you do dialogue with a judge who is accused of pedophilia? Do you do dialogue with a judge who was, I think, asking a 15-year-old or 5-year-old victim of sexual assault, asking her to demonstrate what happened with her in court? There is no judiciary in the Maldives. Let's get the basics right about Maldives. There is no way you can do any, somebody spoke about consensus building. I don't agree. There has to be one consensus in the Maldives, and the consensus is either you have Nasheed there, don't bring Nasheed, get democracy in Maldives, because if democracy is not there in Maldives, nothing is ever going to happen there. There is a set of people who's going to shout, a set of people, as you pointed out, it's a grassroots movement. That's a great thing. The grassroots movement is keeping the democracy, the flames of democracy alive, but how long will they be able to sustain it? That's the biggest question we face today. Do we face any other question? No. I think for all countries, we need to, understand that there is no space for consensus building anymore. That space is gone. What we need now is, something which our present Prime Minister says that that we need to actually proactively look at our neighbors. Because the road to democracy in Maldives was painful. But as Anni's brother, Nazim, his younger brother, he told me the demise of democracy can also be very quick, and it has happened. He told me that, just during when the coup was happening, and it has exactly happened. But why India? I mean, why in India do we talk about Maldives? What's the need for talking about Maldives? Because Maldives needs a voice, because the Maldivians is often isolated from the mainstream, because I'm a journalist, so I say mainstream of journalism and our thought process as much as it's isolated in the Indian Ocean. Because Maldives needs its space in history as well as geography. And we haven't given Maldives that till now. And, there were a lot of expectations. I was speaking to Ambassador Saidev before coming here, and there were a lot of expectations from a new regime. We have still not understood what is the problem, because we lost the mango and the sack in 2012 in Maldives. Do we want to lose it all over again? Because they are looking, if one hope they're looking at, is a hope of, somewhere that New Delhi will act. There is a call for action. Maldivians are going out on the street. They have given the call for action. Somebody needs to back them up. And that's what if we call ourselves a democracy, that's a democracy in the neighborhood. And Maldives is exactly facing, as you pointed out, Niranjan, in terms of the democracy crisis, is exactly facing what happened to Bangladesh in 1971. Then what happened to Sheikh Mujib? The army took over. It's difficult for the army to go back to the barracks. I understand all that. But having said that, what happened to Bangladesh in 2006? Maldives stands at that crossroad. Because Bangladesh, as you know, there is no middle ground, right? There is either Bengali nationalism versus extremist radicalism. There is no middle ground. In Maldives, they also stand at a crossroad, because at that time, the nationalists, the people who were secular, they were saying in Bangladesh at that time that it's a survival at stake. And somebody said very clearly that, the survival of Maldives and the democracy and the concept of Maldives is at stake. That Maldives that we used to talk about in 2006, the most secular Sunni, 100% Sunni Muslim nation, no longer there. And who is to blame for that? Because when Nasheed came to power, he gave the first interview which kind of opened that Pandora's box. He gave an interview to me where he said for the first time that yes, there are Maldivians who have gone to Afghanistan and they're participating. They're basically fighting alongside the Taliban. Nobody in Maldives was willing to accept that. There was a man from Guantanamo Bay who was sent back from Guantanamo Bay. This man, I'm forgetting his name. His name is Sheikh something. And he was, he was roaming around. Gayoom actually allowed him to roam around the streets. What is interesting, what we need, because there have always been this sinister geopolitical design when it comes to the Maldives, because Maldives is so geopolitically strategic, and we have not been able to understand what Maldives is in terms of from New Delhi's perspective, as a geopolitical place. Forget from Maldives' perspective. For 30 years, India supported Gayoom. He was Asia's longest ruling dictator, all that everybody knows. But, when democracy came, which New Delhi backed actually after much reluctance, thanks to a lot of wrong assessments and a lot of wrong inputs which came under, it was Nasheed who allowed India to set up radars on 10 atolls of India. And I'm here talking from a very Indian perspective. Sure. So, I'll wrap up by saying this. We need some strong action in Maldives. We cannot allow Maldives to be treated as an Achilles knee, and but it should be given its due respect in history and geography. And in this journey, I think India should not be shy to protect and cradle democracy and directly do it. The Maldivians would like that. For a tiny nation of about 400,000, I think, staying in an archipelago, it would be more momentous than anything that our aspiring superpower can achieve ever. Thank you.
Thank you all. I know it's been a long evening, but we'd like to open the floor for comments, questions. Maybe we'll take a few and then allow each speaker about, I know we're very short of time, but concluding remarks of 2 minutes. We'll give Ibra the maximum time for concluding remarks, maybe 4 minutes. Are there any questions from the floor? And whoever has questions, if you could come to the podium so Ibra can also hear you in the Maldives. No questions? Do the panelists have questions? Devyani, if you could come here to ask the question. Even if you don't have any questions, but interventions, those would be welcome.
My question is to Mr. Abraham. If you can hear me clearly? He can. Yes. Yeah.
Ibra, you can hear us, right? You've muted your mic. If you could turn it on. Yeah.
So, past few months onwards, we see an increasing aggressive response from the government of Maldives to international community's responses to what's happening. Two examples to cite this. One is, of course, what was already mentioned, the reaction to the UPR process, what the foreign minister said. And a similar reaction was made when the EU Parliament passed a resolution raising concern about developments in Maldives, and the foreign minister made strong statements, also saying that I think Maldives' human rights records is better than many European countries. So, can you explain that a little bit? That to me seems surprising for a country that is actually so dependent on it's an import economy and heavily connected with international community. Can you explain this reaction? Why is this happening? And basically, I'm just a little surprised at the confidence of the government to do that. So can you explain that a little bit?
So the most of the time we discuss about the India's role and more responsibility, but there is no, people to people contact is fine, but what we can do more than China in Maldives? My second question is before Ambassador Sahadev sir. During coup and its trouble, we do not discuss the role of acting ambassadors and station officers. Sometimes we need to discuss about, because it happens because it may be wrong, but maybe because of lethargy or the inactiveness of acting ambassadors. So could you elaborate the role of ambassadors and station officers during trouble? Thank you.
Question is to Ibrahim ji.
Can you introduce yourself?
Vijay Pratap, live in Delhi, part of PSAARC. I was wondering the kind of judiciary's negative resilience to any democratic fair trial issues and the kind of political atmosphere. What is the maximum Indian civil society can do which will sustain the hope in Maldivian polity?
One last question, and then we'll give Ibrahim some time. Would you, one last question, and then we'll give Ibrahim some time to respond, and the other panelists as well.
Hi, I'm Avinash, I'm working with ActionAid, and my question for Sadhu sir. During coup time, I recall that India acted so swiftly, and during this, why we are very reluctant and we are not taking a proper step? Is there any motive, or is there something which is hindering India's move to protect democracy in Maldives? And The second question to Ibrahim sir, that the judiciary in Maldives is acting very negatively. I read that that petition which is filed to international court, and here what kind of constitutional rights are there to curtail this kind of thing, and what is the way forward you are thinking to mitigate this kind of things in future? That if you throw some light on that, thank you.
One more question. Just absolutely the last question. If you could come up very quickly so that we can. Last question.
I am Group Captain Ashok Chordia from the Center for Air Power Studies. I am doing a definitive study on Operation Cactus, Maldives. In 1988, when the coup took place, I was in the first aircraft which landed there to support the Gayoom government. My observation is that a country can intervene in the other country only at the request of the country, and we cannot. As a democratic country, we cannot enter the other country and respond to the requests of the people. Under the present circumstances, I don't think it will be possible for a country to intervene. Thank you.
First time there was an official request by the President of Maldives to the Indian government to come to the assistance of the then democratically elected, or the way democracy was defined at that time in Maldives, and we responded. But you know, it's not boots on the ground, as the Americans call it, is not the only option for a state. There are many, many ways in which governments can influence events in areas of their interest. And I don't think we have, I think we failed to use those options. It's not that the game is over, it will go on for some time. And I think this government has at least so far shown that they are willing to be a little more strict than the last government was. As to the role of the ambassador, I think you must remember that I was long retired, therefore not in the know of things, and sitting in India. I think I'm going to pass the buck here. Suman Chakravarti, who was very much on the ground, who was active, and whatever information I might have was basically from him. So I let him feel that.
Just very quickly to sort of re-emphasize, I think there needs to be a lot of international action and a lot of international attention on the deteriorating human rights situation. India, of course, because it is an important player, it has deep relations with the Maldives. Yesterday was a start at the Universal Periodic Review. India needs to use its bilateral ties, good offices, to re-emphasize and help create space for civil society, an independent judiciary, and basic political freedoms. But also the other players who've been mentioned, part of the international community. China has a growing clout. China needs to be supportive of this process. The European Union, the United States, SAARC countries as well, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, who have close ties with the Maldives. Because no one is talking about an intervention here, but we are talking about solidarity and continuing to support the civil political rights in the Maldives. So one can only hope that we do our part and the governments also put in their part to help the situation out.
Ivani, you sure you don't? Okay, Dr. Sahu.
Regarding your question about China and how India can actually counter Chinese sort of capture of Maldives is very difficult in a sense that China is spread all across South Asia. In fact, that theory, string of pearls and whatever you believe, one country another, after another, it's been encircling, and probably it's in a greater design of sort of geopolitical reality. So you saw that in Sri Lanka and Maldives. But India has actually, when it comes to the question of democracy, India has actually number of options. One is, of course, to internationalize this particular case, and India has been actively doing it, but in a more silent, very sort of manner, not to show any sort of sign that India is doing it very proactively with sort of eye-catching kind of work. But I can tell, at least with I was privy to a meeting last week in Brussels with some of those European Union external assistants. They basically support democracy and human rights, this thing. So some of those officials were sharing that they have been planning and trying to persuade Maldives present regime to not become really repressive, and they're trying to restrain and also ensure that democratic process and other things also take through civil society and others. So there are all kind of actors who are doing, and India actually can make an impact with internationalizing this issue and bringing a very healthy collaboration with EU and America on this issue. So that way India can actually isolate China, because China is a kind of regime that doesn't actually see whether the cat is black or white, as long as it's able to catch the rat. So it's a pure sort of regime that actually goes with whatever its national interest. It doesn't really see the values, what we call democracy or human rights. So that is where I think India has to make a very careful sort of thing.
There was a question on what makes Maldives so confident. Why are they so brazen about their human rights, etc.? Actually, Maldives is just $2 to $3 billion economy, and 30% of it comes from tourism, and 50% of the tourists are Chinese. So, and when Xi Jinping was in Malé, he said, "Don't worry, whatever facility you have, we will fill it up." So that's where the confidence comes from. Thank you.
Last remarks from Shumon.
Well, the cat is black or white, as long as it catches the rat is fine. But who exactly will bell the cat is the big question. Because I'll tell you, somebody told me China, you were talking about China, and I think I missed out on that point, because China today is openly wooing. You say the Chinese tourists are coming, but they're just coming for the last 4 years. Before that, there were no Chinese, soul on that shores of the Indian Ocean. They didn't know about Maldives, as we also did not, mostly. So what China is doing right now, they're no longer covert. They're openly wooing. But in the 1990s, Gayoom had come to a secret defense agreement with the Chinese to provide an entire island for a submarine base in return for enhanced arms supplies to the Maldivian army. After all that, so-called friendship and 21-hour long phone calls and, going there to save Gayoom's government, the dictatorship, and all of that we did. Gayoom was doing this, but then the Chinese could not trust him. Finally, they could not trust him, and that's why they did not finally go ahead with that agreement. But there was a process which was started. Number two, what they're doing right now is completely different. They're openly doing things. What India has not done. India talks about India talks about giving money to their GDP to support their budget, but we don't do anything which is, because perception rules the world today, and we are not doing anything that is perceptive. They have built your museum there. The Chinese have built a huge museum which is so beautiful. They have aided your biggest mosque. They have done everything which you can see. It's right in there in front of your eyes. And we are not doing anything that can tell the Maldivians that India is the closest nation, India is your friend, New Delhi will always stand up to you. We are not doing anything perceptive, and if packaging, call it packaging, but the world has moved along, and we need that visual show of support to Maldivians for them to understand that India still exists. India still has a stance in Maldives. Only a week before he was ousted in 2012, I can tell you this story, that Nasheed was being pushed by one of his top officers in the armed forces to sign a defense agreement with China. He steadfastly refused, and he has been refusing for 3 months. I have been privy to telephone conversations with his ministers, where the Chinese CEO of the Chinese National Bank, I think, called him up just before a week before the visit of Nasheed's couple of ministers to China as part of a diplomatic process, and said, just tell us what you need. They were giving them a blank check. They were saying, what do you need? We are ready to pay you. India never did anything of that sort. Having said that, in the past, as I said, during Manmohan Singh's regime, we lost not just our marbles in diplomatic engagement, but friends in the process. We lost our credibility, and with a history of dumping friends, particularly in that era, from Maldives to Bangladesh to Burma, the reality was stark. We, as I said before, in our own, when we failed to back the democratic dreams of the Maldivian public, it was very clear that our foreign policy was somewhat at a loss. And Maldives needed your support at that time. When we deterred as a coup d'etat forced the first democratic president, all the ghosts of the past came crawling out of the cupboard, and they came crawling out because, and I insist, because there's an article in one of the most, I think, respected columnists from Maldives, Azra Naseem, who also is now in exile, mostly because she can't come back to the country. So she wrote this in Guardian, and I think she said very clearly that she explained it, why that $800 million scam was responsible. Remember this, we talk about the tortures during Gayoom's regime. Remember that we have to talk about the corruption also in Gayoom's regime, because very conveniently we have forgotten that. And Nasheed needs to take a lot of blame for that. He showed a lot of grace. He talked about reconciliation when people had told him very clearly, reconciliation is fine, but there has to be a political reconciliation. You cannot give a blank check of reconciliation. And what happened as a result is that all these forces always remained in power behind his back. Democracy was never truly established in Maldives, and this time something needs to give. It will be this way, because Maldives, the democracy part of Maldives, the people who love democracy in the Maldives, they are losing out. They are losing hope. They might be out on the streets, but believe you me, they need support. And this is the time for the world to show support, and definitely for New Delhi to show support. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
And the call that Ibra is giving out to the Indian civil society to support them in their hour of crisis, we hope from the People's SAARC that we may be able to act a little bit on this, and in future deepen our links with the civil society in the Maldives. Ibra and I have been talking about that all day today. We hope to be able to act on that. I thank you all once again, and especially the speakers. Thank you. आधा घंटा हमारे साथ